Welcome to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. I'm Elena Balko, co-organizer of the BASIS study group for minority history. The series is part of the Institute of Historical Research Centennial Commemorations, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the study group. It was made possible through the help and support of the British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities in the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeast Europe and promoting closer scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. On today's episode, Professor Andrii Portnov at the European University Viadrina talks to us about Ukraine and its entangled history. Andrii, welcome to the podcast. Can you start by telling us a little about yourself and your academic journey?
Hello, so my name is Andrii Portnov. I was born in Ukraine and I've graduated at first from Dnipro University in history and then from Warsaw University in cultural studies. And I've defended my dissertation in Lviv. It was about Ukrainian emigration in Interwar Poland. And since 2012, I live and work in Germany. And since 2018, I'm a professor of Entangled History of Ukraine at the European University Viadrina, Frankfurt, Oder. And in terms of, let's say, topics I'm interested in, I would say that it's pretty broad, actually, because my first publications, they were about, let's say, historiography of Old Rus, which sounds a bit crazy nowadays. And at the moment, I'm finishing my book on Dnipro, so my native city. And I'm also trying to do several projects about, I would call it kind of intellectual history of Eastern Europe in the 20th century, mostly, let's say, in the interwar period. Yeah, so something like that.
Thank you. As professor for the Ukrainian studies at Viadrina, have you perhaps noticed any difference in the way Ukrainian studies are conceptualized in Ukraine and abroad? If so, what are the main differences in doing Ukrainian studies or Ukrainian history, to be more precise, outside of Ukraine?
Yeah, of course, there are differences. I would say the basic difference is that in Ukraine, Ukrainian history is first and foremost presented, exercised as a national history, yeah. And in case of studying Ukrainian history everywhere else, in Poland, but especially in Germany, in France, in Great Britain, I would say that the basic problem is the lack of deeper cultural connections to Ukraine. Very simply, for instance, I remember giving a lecture in Brussels once, and I've mentioned Taras Shevchenko just for the sake of the argument, and I was immediately asked by students and colleagues to explain whom am I talking about. So it's the name of the biggest Ukrainian writer, so if you use it in Ukraine, at least kind of, everybody will somehow understand what I'm talking about, even though Shevchenko is a complicated figure, of course, and it's not so easy to understand, but that's a different story. And in case of Germany, for instance, you need to explain literally everything. So to start your talk or your book, your article, from the explanation of the entire, background, context, and so on, which is not bad. But I should tell it's really different from, for example, Russian history or Russian literature, because in this case, there is this background knowledge you could rely on. And in my experience, that's seriously the most, let's say, noticeable, visible difference.
There seems to be a certain confusion over the correct term to use when referring to this subject. Some prefer the history of Ukraine, the history of the Ukrainian lands, or simply Ukrainian history. Do all those terms mean the same thing? And how is it reflective of the multi-ethnic character of Ukrainian past?
So you see, I'm lucky, seriously, I'm lucky to have professorship which is called Entangled History of Ukraine. It's not my term, believe me. So I've just applied for the position called like that. But I think it's really nice name because on the one hand, it still has Ukraine in it. Yeah. So it's not just like Eastern Europe or whatever, but at the same time, it stresses this idea of entanglements. And entanglement in this case means on the one hand, Ukrainian history linked, interrelated, interconnected to Polish, Jewish, Russian, Ottoman, Soviet, Armenian history. Yeah. On the other hand, it means inclusion of different groups and experiences on the territory of Ukraine into the narrative, so to say. Yeah. And for instance, if you ask me like what lectures do I give, it's usually something like entangled stuff. For instance, it could be about Ukrainian Polish history and asymmetric relations. Yeah, it could be about the Jews in Eastern Europe, first and foremost, again, in Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. Once I did a great course about, great experience for me, of course, maybe it was not so great, I don't know, about Ukraine and Belarus. So comparing two, let's say, yeah, two histories of, nation, state, territory, language, whatever, name it, and also different present-day models of political systems. So I think nowadays, speaking seriously, nobody will treat Ukrainian history in a purely ethnic categories. It makes no sense. And I don't see a problem, actually, speaking about history of Ukraine and automatically understanding that it includes, of course, the history of the Jews, of the Crimean Tatars, of the Poles, of also the Russians, of course, in Ukraine, and other groups and other, let's say, historical context. That's quite an obvious thing to me.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the present. On 21st of August, 24th of August, Ukraine celebrated 30th year of independence. This year, unlike in previous years, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the key messages was of Ukraine's renewed independence. Where do you think this is coming from? What is behind this shift in understanding of Ukraine's history? And how important is it for the ways in which we read and interpret Ukraine's past?
Actually, yeah, I should tell that I've been to Ukraine in August, not exactly in the celebration days, but right before them. It was very interesting because, Ukraine is a very dynamic, as we all know, is a very dynamic society and country. It always surprises, at least me, it surprises me. Yeah. And coming to a question, I would put, so my impression is that this idea of renewing independence, it was somehow present since the very beginning, I mean, since 1991. And why so? In my view, it's pretty understandable. So already the very first, let's say, post-Soviet government, first president, Leonid Kravchuk, they wanted, at the symbolical level, to show that Ukraine, as a newly born post-Soviet state, is not just a product of the Soviet politics, but it has a deeper historical, if you wish, pre-Soviet roots. And that's pretty understandable. And for instance, in case of Kravchuk, so early 90s, there was a ceremony when the official representative of the Ukrainian People's Republic abroad, it's a kind of a formal position, of course, he symbolically gave his insignia to Kravchuk as the president of Ukraine. So you see this logic that post-Soviet Ukraine is not something that came to be out of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, but it's something that is based on the experiences of at least Ukrainian People's Republic and Ukrainian state of Hetman Skoropadsky in the 1980s, 1990s. But also, if you wish, of course, it could refer to the Cossack state, to the great, and then you have this entire historical mythology behind it. I think it's nothing unusual. It's rather typical for, let's say, historical consciousness, especially in Eastern Europe. And in terms of scholarship, I would say that it is important for us as historians to be aware of both. I mean, of this deep Soviet impact on what, let's say, happened to Ukraine after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s and later on, but also on the existing, at least intellectual, reference to the previous attempts of Ukrainian statehood. Because we should be aware, of course, the Soviet project was not the very first Ukrainian project, not at all, not at all. It also referred actually to different projects from the age of revolutions, yeah, and they referred to Cossacks and so on. So you have this kind of, this heritage logic or this background logic behind it. And as for me, it's pretty understandable. We should be realistic about it.
Ukraine was once the borderland of three different empires: Imperial Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. To reflect this geopolitical complexity, many history textbooks tend to include at least two different storylines, one for the Dnipro Ukraine under the Russian Tsars, and another for Western Ukraine that existed as a crownland of the Habsburg monarchy. Do you believe it is possible to look beyond this separation in order to write a comprehensive history of Ukraine? And if so, when would such historical accounts start?
Actually, I would say that we are lucky, again, we historians, we are lucky because in case of Ukraine national project, cultural project, we have this fascinating competition, coexistence, whatever, I mean, between the Habsburg and the Romanovs empires, yeah? Furthermore, we know nowadays that it was largely due to the fact that Ukrainian lands were divided between those two big empires. We have, yeah, one could say kind of a big success of Ukrainian national project later on in the 20th century. And it becomes clear if you compare it again to Belarus and the Belarusian national project. It's very important. Let's keep it in mind. So the history of Belarusian national movement, yeah, is a history of movement in the Russian Empire. Because after the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the entire territory of modern Belarus became part of Russia, yeah, and it was not the case of Ukraine, yeah. So in case of Ukraine, large parts, and especially, of course, the city of Lviv, yeah, and entire East Galicia. Actually, East Galicia is an Austrian category that is also important to be aware of. So there was no Eastern Galicia before the Habsburgs. Okay, so because of that, Ukrainian project could rely on this, again, competition between the empires, yeah. And let us not forget, for instance, that in Belarus, the Russian government managed to destroy the Greek Catholic Church. Yeah, and as we know, it was not destroyed. On the contrary, it was even to some extent supported by the Habsburgs, yeah, in Austria. And as we also know, actually, exactly this church, through the Greek Catholic Church, was one of the, maybe even the most important element of the Ukrainian national movement in Eastern Galicia. Yeah. So in other words, I think that is actually what makes this story so fascinating, this, let's say, existence of two imperial experiences, yeah, in it. And I would say there is no way to write Ukrainian history without keeping it in mind. Because seriously, every important book publication or cultural project in the Russian Empire, so it was always somehow, let's say, it had also some references to what was going on in Austria. We know that after the decisions to impose restrictions on Ukrainian language, yeah, Ukrainian language books from the Russian Empire were published in Lviv, and so on. And then also people from Lviv were coming to so-called Dnipro Ukraine to look at the Cossack territories. And so we have this fascinating story. And I think it is also, actually, it's also kind of entanglement, if you wish. And that is why I think we not just should, we have no other way but to include all those stories into the narrative. Also, of course, not forgetting about like smaller, let's say, other experiences like the Ottoman Empire in present-day Ukrainian territories, of course, the Hungarian presence and so on. But still, I would say the Habsburg and the Romanovs Empire, they really, yeah, they formed, let's say, this landscape or space. They formed the space in which Ukrainian national project succeeded.
Turning to the issues of minorities now. Ethnic and confessional diversity has always been a feature of the Ukrainian lands. At the same time, Ukraine was home to some of the most horrific instances of ethnic cleansing in modern European history. A growing body of research supports the idea that ethnic-based violence became an unintended consequence of national self-determination and support for the nation-state, as facilitated by the inter-Versailles system and institutionalized through the League of Nations. This shift from the world of empire to the world of nations is often viewed as a key reason why so many borderland populations who had coexisted for centuries descended into violence. What is your opinion on this? Does the desire to form a nation state precipitate ethnic violence? And was Ukraine that unique in the level of ethnic violence committed on its territory?
Okay, so first of all, I think that it would be, in my view at least, it would be a bit, let's say, reductionist or oversimplified to make a conclusion like the one saying that, okay, in the age of empires, we have more tolerance or more like peaceful coexistence, yeah, and in the age of a nation state, we automatically have violence, ethnic cleansings, and genocides. I think it's not so simple. And furthermore, I will say that as historians, we need to be very careful and cautious in analyzing every particular case of, for instance, name it, pogroms, ethnic cleansings, and the genocides. We need to contextualize it properly, because otherwise it's very dangerous just to make some, let's say, political, ideological, claims about it, which could be misleading sometimes. Now, very interesting. Let's think about the fact that all the big empires, imperial powers on the European continent, they somehow declined and collapsed, and all of them were, one could say, replaced by the nation states. Was it just a coincidence? Was there any, deeper logic behind it? That's a difficult question to answer. Actually, it's not so obvious at all. And then, again, we could, of course, find some examples of terrible mass crimes committed by the empires in their overseas colonies, but not only. If you look closely at the Russian history, for instance, and also histories of some other states. On the other hand, when the nation state came to being, it is interesting that we see it already, let's say, I would say on the eve of the First World War. We see this belief that if we want some particular state to be efficient economically, socially, politically, it is better for this state to be ethnically homogeneous. That's a dangerous idea, of course. That's a dangerous idea that brought a lot of problems, for instance, to the interwar Poland. So again, like the topic of mine, my very first PhD dissertation, because you see interwar Poland, this state also actually viewed itself as a renewed Poland, so the Poland before the partitions, and it had an enormous problem how to treat all those national minorities within its borders. First of all, Ukrainians, but also Jews, Germans, and others. And I would say this state failed to find a proper answer to this question till the very end. They were on the one hand, pretending or hoping, to view Poland as a nation state, so a state of Poles, so ethnic Poles. On the other hand, it was pretty clear that there are millions of Polish citizens of different ethnic origin, different religion, different language. And now, nowadays, it brings us to the question, okay, and what about, nowadays world, maybe post-national world, as someone said, which I'm not so sure about, actually. Why it's so important, I think, for our discussion also, that Ukraine nowadays is really not just multi-something country, it's a really diverse society, And some people inside Ukraine, also intellectuals, and also some people outside Ukraine, intellectuals, politicians, name it, they are, I would say, afraid of this diversity. The logic behind this fear is the same as I've described before. So in order to be efficient economically and politically, it's better, kind of better, supposedly better, to be homogeneous. Again, I'm not sure about it, but that's like the logic or the argument behind the point. In other words, if you wish, we could say that the success or the failure of Ukrainian state project after the collapse of the Soviet Union is also very much kind of a success or a failure or a question mark for the idea of diversity in Europe. So I'm always saying that, often saying that nowadays Ukraine is a kind of a laboratory of diversity and different, let's say, attitudes, approaches to it. That is why it's so interesting to look closely at what is going on in language sphere, in religious sphere, in, all those debates on, of course, like history, monuments, whatever, because behind them, we have a society which is much more diverse than, for instance, its neighbors in the West. I mean, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, name it. All of them, they're much more homogeneous than Ukraine. Belarus is much more homogeneous. So it's really fascinating to think about it, how such type of society could function. And I think it's very important also for the entire debate on Europe, metaphorically speaking, of course, Europe. What is Europe? What are European values? Stuff like that. Because in this debate about Europe, we have again a lot of talks about diversity. But at the same time, we have some, I would say, even reluctance to an extent to look deeper and to understand the nature of this diversity in Ukraine. What do I mean, for instance? Very simple, like this language issue, this classical story. The language situation in Ukraine is so unique. It could not be compared to, the Swiss one, the Canadian one, name it. It's really very, very interesting. It has also its social dimension. It has geographical dimension. It has age dimension, so generational dimension, and so on. And I'm amazed by the fact that, for instance, a lot of also German colleagues of mine, or French colleagues of mine, even after talks about it, they are still, I would say reluctant to really fully grasp this particular uniqueness. And I think our chance as a Ukrainian scholar, the scholars of Ukrainian studies, is actually to raise topics like that and to show their intellectual potential for the broader debate, again, on diversity, on minorities, on things like that. That is my big hope, that Ukrainian topic could really develop in this direction. That would be great.
Thank you. You previously served as one of the principal investigators for the project Divided Memories, Shared Memories, Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. Could you tell us a bit about its key findings? Is some form of historical reconciliation possible? And can people in these three neighboring countries forgive the atrocities they had committed against each other over the generation, especially in the current political climate?
Okay, so that was a nice project, not a very big one actually, rather small one, I would say, at the University of Geneva. So we've organized several conferences, very interesting conferences in Switzerland, but also in other parts of Europe, in Poland. There was one in Poland, for instance. And as for me, the main result of this project are books. That's maybe kind of a bit old-fashioned, but I still believe that books are important. So we published several books. One book is in English. It's a collection of articles called Official History in Eastern Europe. So it is it's not just about Soviet experience, it's broad. It's about this idea of official history. So having official history for a multinational state, for a national state, for empire, name it, but official history, this category of history becoming official, obligatory. So another book was in French. Actually, I'm also very happy about it because this was a kind of an almost, I would say, popular publication about the key figures in Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian history. So how they are perceived in those three national traditions. For instance, there was articles about Bogdan Khmelnytsky, about Simon Petlura, but also about some figures from Russian, about Pilsudski, very important person, and so on. And actually, when you at first read, then write, and then read again this stuff, you see actually it's really incredible that there are some persons like Khmelnytsky, for instance, who are methodologically perceived in a very different way in those three different national traditions, even though those three views are pretty, let's say, I would say, yeah, like far away from the complex historical reality, you know, of 17th century, yeah, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Khmelnytsky uprising and stuff like that. So you could feel this difference between the event or the figure and the mythology around it. That was really fascinating. And speaking about reconciliation, I would say that that was not our aim. Our aim was, you know, our aim at this project was actually to look deeper historically at the origins and development of different stereotypes we have nowadays. Because again, as we all know, there are so many stereotypes, my God, like in Ukraine about Russia, in Poland about Ukraine, in Poland about Russia, and so on. In Russia about, of course, like everybody else. And our task was to look deeper, not just at, let's say, last 30 years, but also deeper, sometimes even hundreds years deeper. Yeah, so not just even Soviet times, but really deeper, and looking for, let's say, if you wish, like the logic of these stereotypical developments. Yeah, and there were some interesting findings also, for instance, some stuff about cinema, because of course, as we know, this modern media, they are very much they are very successful in promoting, again, mythologies and yeah, mass cultural, let's say, attitudes to history. And what we also tried our best to do, we tried to present the findings in different contexts. So not just in Switzerland, in Geneva, but also to do it in Poland, to do it in Ukraine, to do it in some Russian language publication. And I think it was a good idea actually to, like, how to put it, let's say, to engage yourself into this intercultural, you know, exchange or debate, which is not easy, as we could imagine, especially nowadays. And talking about this, like, current situation, so frankly speaking, how to put it, I'll put it this way. I am not, at least I'm trying not to be naive about, you know, such things as finding a common ground, a common solution for, let's say, Ukrainian, Russian historical stereotypes right now, when the war is going on, when we have this terrible propaganda all around and so on. But at the same time, I still believe that at least in academic writing, so in our, like, serious academic research, we could continue producing good, serious, reliable stuff about those complicated issues. In other words, I am aware that we could not stop this propaganda, but at the same time, I don't want to stop myself from writing about also Russian history or some difficult topics in Ukrainian Polish history. So I think the real problem here is that how this academic level could be, yeah, presented, at least, not just transferred, presented in this sphere of mass media or political debate. Here I am really, you know, skeptical, because maybe I should say that I've spent some time trying to do something like that. So I've engaged myself in different public debates, at first in Ukraine, then in Poland, then in Germany, you know, about history, about reconciliation. And I should say that my, at least personal experience, is that we historians should be realistic about the results of such exercises. Yeah. Why so? Because first and foremost, it is not easy at all to bring our academic language, which is supposed to be, of course, you know, unbiased, contextualized, complex, and so on, into a public debate which often seeks for easy answers, yeah, clear cuts, you know, black and white division lines, and so on. And that's a real problem, that the language of academia is, yeah, somehow separated from the language of public debate. Not just in Ukraine, I would say also in other countries, also in Germany, also in Poland. And I have no solution to this problem. My personal decision is to limit my own engagement into this public debate and to focus more on producing academic texts. Whether that's a good decision to everyone, I don't know. That's just my personal story I'm sharing with you. But I think every one of us should ask her or himself, for instance, why are we doing that? If we are invited to, to write an article for the newspaper, or to give a radio talk, or to go on television show, because I've did it, and it could be a pretty traumatic experience.
Speaking of academic texts, your forthcoming book is a biography of the city of Dnipro, formerly known as Dnipropetrovsk in central Ukraine, entitled City Without Myth. Why did you decide to focus on this particular city, and what about it might be of interest for Western audiences? Also, what are the challenges of writing microhistory, and what is the myth or absence of referred to in the title?
Yeah, thank you so much, Marian. That's a question that is very important and difficult actually for me. So first of all, the title of this book will probably be a different one, because my American publishers are not very happy with this City Without Myth. So we'll see. So I could not tell you right now the final version of it, but probably should be a different one, which is not bad again, because it's just a metaphor. You could use another metaphor, which is okay. But why this city? That's not easy to answer, because what I could tell you that I started this project when I left my hometown, my hometown, Dnipro or Dnipropetrovsk. So when I lived there and worked there, I've been interested in something completely different, mostly Polish history, stuff like that, Crimean history also, but when I left, at first to Warsaw, then to Kyiv, I somehow realized that it is really fascinating to look back, and to write the story of this place. That was my personal motivation behind it. Now, why without myth? Because it's actually, when I've started thinking about the book, I've also talked to different colleagues of mine, especially to those who are from Dnipro. And in those conversations, several times, this idea came that is the city that is so difficult to define, because it kind of it is impossible to briefly say it's a city of some could say rocket industry, or Brezhnev heritage, or if you wish, it could be said a city of Viktor Petrov Domontovich and Valerian Podmohylny. One could say it's about a Jewish past and present, the biggest Jewish community center in the world, and so on. And then the next question, how to combine it, Jewish center and Brezhnev. Is there any, connection between them? Or, for instance, those Ukrainian writers and, let's say, Russian imperial project of the late 18th century, this entire Potemkin stuff, and turning this place into the third capital of the Russian Empire, and so on. And then I used this, I picked up actually this metaphor from those conversations in order to explain that sometimes there are places which lack a defined mythology, because we have some kind of mythology, let's say, around Odessa. We have it even around, places like, on Kyiv, of course. You could still somehow define it. It could be about Orthodoxy, or about Babi Yar, or about, Bulgakov and this stuff, but still you could find such elements. In case of Dnipro, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and I started playing with it. Why this book could be interesting for the Western audience? Okay, so first of all, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe it will not be interesting. Who knows? But my idea in writing this book was that I'll try my best to include different, as you rightly said, micro-historical stories, persons, tendencies, groups, experiences, whatever, into a much broader narrative of European history of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and also trying to look how different theoretical or methodological ideas about writing this history could be applied to a local material which remains unknown in English-speaking world. Because in this case, it was also kind of interesting for me, because the absolute majority of my sources, doesn't matter, published, unpublished, yeah, they are in Russian, Ukrainian, Yiddish, sometimes Polish, German, but, you know, literally a couple of texts in English, that's it. So that's highly unusual, I would say, to have like a book in English, which is where the English language source material is literally like, you know, very, very limited. But that was a kind of a challenge to me. So how could you tell the story that is completely unknown? Because again, you see, if you write a book even about Odessa, first of all, you could rely on existing books about Odessa. Yeah. Second, you have this mythology behind it. You have recognizable names like Isaac Babel, and so on. If you're writing about the Dnipro, okay, maybe you still have some names like Brezhnev, but besides it, you are kind of, yeah, you should present this unknown story in an understandable way, also put into understandable, you know, context. And that was a difficult task. That is why I've spent so many years writing this book. Too many years, I should say, but now I'm happy that it is finished, that it will be published soon, and then you, as well as other readers, will actually tell me, hopefully, will tell me whether this idea of bringing local material into a broader comparative historical context, whether it was fruitful or maybe not. So I'm still not completely sure myself about it. So I'd like to figure it out.
Thank you. I'm personally really looking forward to this book, because my grandfather studied in Dnipropetrovsk in the 50s, but to my shame, I've never been there. So I think this would be a very good introduction to also
you should
what he
go
experienced there. In the post-war Dnipropetrovsk. This was our last question for today. And thank you, Andrii, for joining us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.